Hello friends, welcome into Deep Dive Secrets. The house on Alder Creek Road was the kind of place realtors describe as quietly dignified. A cedar-sided, two-story colonial tucked into a suburban Ohio neighborhood where flags hung from porches year-round and nobody parked on the street overnight. And for Lena Whitmore, it was supposed to be the final proof that her life had stabilized after a decade of careful, sometimes exhausting rebuilding. A place where routines could finally harden into something like peace. She was 38, a senior HR compliance officer for a regional healthcare network, analytical by training and temperament. Someone who trusted processes more than people. And when she bought the house after a clean, amicable separation from her longtime partner, she told herself the square footage wasn't about loneliness. It was about air, about space to think, to reset, to be the version of herself that didn't have to negotiate every feeling, every decision, every compromise. And for the first 6 months, the house rewarded her with exactly that: mornings of filtered sunlight across oak floors, evenings of controlled silence, broken only by the low hum of the HVAC and the soft clink of ice in a glass. Neighbors waved, but didn't pry. Co-workers admired, but didn't question. And even her younger brother, Noah Klein, who lived 2 states away and specialized in calling only when something was wrong, stopped asking if she was really okay. But stability has a way of inviting curiosity. And curiosity, when it goes unanswered, has a way of mutating into obsession. And it started innocently enough on a Sunday afternoon when Lena decided to reorganize the basement storage at purely practical task prompted by an insurance inventory checklist, the kind of adult responsibility that made her feel anchored, competent, and unafraid. The basement itself was unfinished but dry. Concrete walls painted a neutral off-white, exposed beams overhead, shelves along the far wall holding labeled bins from the previous owner, an elderly widower named Calvin Rowe who had lived there for nearly 40 years before passing quietly in a nursing facility. And while Lena had already cleared most of the inherited clutter during her move, she hadn't touched the far corner where an old wardrobe stood flush against the wall, its dark wood incongruous against the pale concrete. A piece she'd assumed was either too heavy or too sentimental to move. Something the estate executor had shrugged off as probably built in. And for months, it existed as visual background noise, something her mind edited out, until that afternoon when she noticed the dust pattern beneath it didn't match the rest of the floor. A faint rectangular outline cleaner than its surroundings, as if the wardrobe had been shifted recently, which made no sense because no one else had keys to the house. And Lena was not the kind of person who ignored things that made no sense. She pulled on gloves, braced herself, and shoved, expecting resistance, maybe a scrape. But instead, the wardrobe slid with a low, controlled glide, revealing behind it a narrow door she had never seen before, painted the same off-white as the wall, handleless, seamless, the kind of architectural omission that felt intentional rather than forgotten. And in that moment, the air in the basement seemed to change. Not colder exactly, but heavier, as if the house had been holding its breath and decided without warning to exhale. Lena stood there longer than she would later admit, cataloging possibilities, the way a professional brain always did storm shelter. Old coal chute, poorly documented storage room yet. None of those explanations accounted for the lack of a handle, or the fact that her inspection report, which she had read line by line, mentioned nothing about additional rooms. And when she finally pressed her palm against the door, it gave way with a soft click, opening inward to reveal a narrow stairwell descending into darkness, unfinished wooden steps leading down at a steeper angle than modern code would allow, lit only by a single bare bulb halfway down, its pull chain dangling motionless. And here is where lesser stories would introduce the supernatural. But this was not that kind of discovery, because what Lena felt was not fear in the cinematic sense, not the adrenaline spike of imagined danger, but something more destabilizing. The sudden awareness that the life she believed she had meticulously audited contained a variable she had not accounted for, a hidden term in the equation. And that realization followed her down the steps as she reached for the chain and flooded the space with light. The room below was small, windowless, and startlingly intentional, with drywall instead of concrete, clean baseboards, and a lockable steel filing cabinet bolted to the floor, alongside a narrow desk, a chair, and shelves lined with manila folders arranged with almost obsessive precision, each labeled in block letters, dates spanning decades, some recent enough to include years. Lena herself remembered vividly, and on the desk, centered as if staged, lay a single photograph face down. and when she picked it up and turned it over, the careful distance she'd maintained between herself and her past collapsed instantly. Because staring back at her was not a stranger, not a crime scene, not a previous homeowner's family, but a younger version of herself, mid-20s. Laughing, unaware, captured at a 4th of July picnic she had attended with friends in Columbus years ago. A photograph she had never known existed, taken from an angle that suggested intention rather than accident. And in that instant, the hidden room stopped being an architectural oddity and became something else entirely. Evidence. Lena did not scream, did not drop the photo, did not run, because panic requires uncertainty, and what she felt instead was a grim, clarifying certainty. But whatever this room was, it was not about the house alone, and whatever had been hidden here was not meant to stay buried forever. And as she stood there, alone beneath her own living room, holding proof that someone had been paying attention to her long before she ever set foot on Alder Creek Road, the question forming in her mind was not who built the room, but why it had waited until now to reveal itself. Lena Whitmore did what she always did when confronted with a problem that refused to explain itself. She documented everything before letting emotion in, backing up the basement stairs to fetch her phone, snapping photos of the hidden stairwell from multiple angles, the absence of hinges on the doorframe, the dust pattern behind the wardrobe, and then, methodically, each wall of the concealed room, the filing cabinet, the shelves, the desk, and finally the photograph itself, which she placed back exactly where she found it. Face down, because some instinct told her the order of things mattered here, that this space functioned according to rules she didn't yet understand. Only after she climbed back up, slid the wardrobe into place, and locked the basement door behind her, did her pulse start to betray her. A delayed response that left her gripping the kitchen counter, breathing through the kind of grounding technique she'd once taught herself during a particularly brutal corporate investigation, and she told herself, with the same firmness she used on underperforming executives, that there would be no spiraling, no late night, just a clean sequence of questions, answered in the right order, starting with the most obvious. Who was Calvin Rowe? Really, the public record version was straightforward enough. A retired civil engineer, widowed, no children volunteer. Treasurer for the local historical society, no criminal history, modest estate, but Lena knew better than to trust surface narratives, and by evening she was deep into archived local papers scanned, PDFs from the county library website, her laptop casting a pale glow across the living room as the house settled into its nighttime quiet. And what she found wasn't scandal but absence. Long stretches of time where Rowe simply vanished from the record. No mentions, no committee meetings, no project credits, nothing, particularly between the late 90s and early 2010s. A period that coincided uncomfortably well with the earliest dates she remembered seeing on those manila folders. The next morning, she took a personal day under the guise of a migraine and drove to the Franklin County Records Office, a squat concrete building that smelled faintly of toner and institutional carpet cleaner, where she requested building permits for Alder Creek Road, expecting redactions or bureaucratic stonewalling, but finding instead something more unsettling. The original blueprints showed no basement room beyond standard storage, no stairwell, no sublevel. And the permits for renovations during Rowe's ownership were sparse and described as structural reinforcement without detail, signed off by inspectors who had since retired or passed away. By noon, Lena was no longer pretending this was a curiosity, because curiosities don't require omission at this scale, and secrecy at this scale requires motive. She returned home with copies tucked into a folder, ate a lunch she didn't taste, and stood in her basement again, staring at the wardrobe as if it might stare back, before finally pulling it aside and descending once more, this time with a legal pad, gloves, and a resolve that felt less like bravery and more like inevitability. She opened the filing cabinet, half expecting an alarm, but the drawers slid out smoothly to reveal neatly organized files, each labeled with a name, a city, and a range of dates. And she felt a brief, irrational relief when she saw that hers was not the only name there. That whatever this was, it wasn't singular, which somehow made it worse. She pulled one folder at random, Marable Soto, Dayton. Oh, and inside found what could only be described as a privately curated biography. Candid photographs from public places, printouts of social media posts annotated with handwritten notes, transcripts of conversations that had no obvious source. Medical appointment dates, employment changes, personal conflicts, summarized in clinical language, and a final page stamped closed with a date and initials Lena didn't recognize. The pattern repeated across folders. Men and women, different ages, different backgrounds, all seemingly ordinary, all documented with a level of detail that exceeded even most law enforcement files. And as she worked through them, a disturbing hypothesis took shape, one that clashed violently with her understanding of consent, privacy, and the invisible boundaries she assumed governed civilian life. These people had been watched, not briefly, not accidentally, but comprehensively, and whatever criteria selected them had nothing to do with celebrity, wealth, or public interest. When Lena finally found her own folder, filed alphabetically under W, her hands were steady in a way that surprised her. The dissociation of someone who has crossed from shock into analysis, and inside she found her life reduced to data points, beginning with her senior year of college, tracking her first job, her relationships, her move into healthcare compliance, even notes on her divorce that referenced arguments she had never voiced aloud, moments she thought had existed only in her head. And the most recent entry was dated 3 months before she bought the house, which answered one question with horrifying clarity. The room had not been built to watch her because she lived there. She lived there because the room already existed. The implications of that reframed every decision she thought she'd made freely, and for the first time, Lena felt something close to fear, not of physical harm, but of narrative theft. The idea that her life had been edited by an unseen hand. She left the basement and called the only person she trusted to hear this without dismissing it as paranoia. Her brother, Noah Klein, a cybersecurity consultant whose professional skepticism was matched only by his loyalty. And when she told him what she'd found, he didn't interrupt, didn't joke, didn't reassure, just listened. The silence on the line stretching until she worried the call had dropped, before he finally said, "Don't touch anything else," with a gravity that made her chest tighten, and promised to drive in that night. Noah arrived after midnight, his rental car crunching softly on the gravel drive, and together they reopened the hidden room, this time with a portable scanner, a camera, and the shared understanding that whatever they were dealing with was bigger than either of them. And as Noah photographed the folders, his jaw set in a way Lena recognized from childhood moments when he realized an adult explanation didn't add up. He pointed out details she'd missed. The consistent formatting of the notes, the coded shorthand that suggested multiple contributors, the way certain names were cross-referenced with symbols rather than explanations, and most tellingly, the presence of a second, smaller cabinet she hadn't opened, which contained digital storage devices. External hard drives labeled by year, some as recent as last summer. They didn't plug anything in, resisting the urge to note too much too fast, because Noah insisted that curiosity without strategy was how people disappeared. A phrase he said casually but meant literally, and by dawn they had agreed on a plan that felt both cautious and absurd. They would identify someone else from the files, who was still alive, still local, and still reachable. Someone whose life intersected with Lena's, enough to suggest pattern but not intimacy, and the name they circled was Andrea Pell, a former colleague from a compliance training seminar years earlier, someone Lena remembered as competent, guarded, and abruptly absent from the professional circuit after a sudden job change. Tracking Andrea down took less time than expected, a LinkedIn profile, with sparse updates leading to a consulting address in Cincinnati. And when Lena sent a carefully neutral email asking to reconnect, she received a reply within an hour. A single line that read, "I was wondering when you'd find it," which drained the color from this morning and confirmed what Lena had begun to suspect. The hidden room was not just a record of secrets. It was part of an unfinished system, one that relied not on walls and locks, but on the silence of those who had already learned too much. Andrea Pell agreed to meet under conditions that immediately reframed the situation from unsettling to actively dangerous, insisting on a crowded location with no predictable routine, and they settled on a rotating pop-up cafe inside Cincinnati Union Terminal, a place dense with tourists, security cameras, and architectural sight lines that made private surveillance difficult. And when Lena arrived with Noah, Andrea was already there, seated with her back to a column, eyes scanning reflections in the polished floor rather than faces older than Lena remembered, but sharpened rather than worn, the kind of composure that suggested someone who had learned how to survive by anticipating threats rather than reacting to them. She didn't bother with pleasantries, didn't ask how Lena had been, didn't even acknowledge Noah until he introduced himself. And then she leaned forward and said, quietly, "The room isn't yours, and it never was. But now that you've opened it, you're part of the liability," which was not an accusation so much as a diagnosis. and Lena felt the last of her denial drain away. Over the next 90 minutes, spoken in fragments and half-finished sentences that avoided names and specifics, Andrea outlined a structure that was less conspiracy than ecosystem. A privately funded behavioral intelligence project that began decades earlier under the euphemism of risk anticipation, originally pitched to insurers and corporate boards as a way to model human unpredictability by studying ordinary lives over long periods. Not criminals, not high-profile figures, but people statistically likely to intersect with sensitive systems. Finance, infrastructure, compliance people like Lena selected, not because of who they were, but because of where they might end up. And Calvin Rowe, he turned it out, was not the architect but the custodian. One node in a distributed network of physical archives designed to exist outside digital oversight, maintained by retirees with clean records and technical backgrounds who understood how to build things that didn't attract attention. The confrontation escalated when Noah asked the obvious question. Andrea had walked away if she knew all this. Andrea's composure cracked just enough to reveal anger, not fear, explaining that she hadn't left. She'd been released, her file stamped closed after she made a choice the system couldn't model, marrying someone outside her predicted profile and taking a job that removed her from regulated industries, a deviation that marked her as noise rather than signal, and noise, in their world, was simply archived and forgotten. Lena listened, tracking the implications with a growing sense of fury, because this wasn't just surveillance, it was narrative manipulation, a feedback loop where observation shaped outcome, where the knowledge that someone was being watched influenced the opportunities quietly placed in their path. The conflicts escalated or smoothed over. The doors that opened just easily enough to feel earned. The real confrontation came not from Andrea's revelations, but from what Noah uncovered later that night, when they returned to Alder Creek Road and, against his own advice, he accessed one of the external drives using an air-gapped laptop revealing internal memos that referenced Lena directly, not as a subject, but as a variable. Someone whose ethical rigidity made her useful in stress-testing compliance failures. And buried among the files was a future projection dated 2 years out, a scenario tree that ended with Lena publicly exposing a healthcare data breach that had not yet occurred. A breach that, according to the memo, would be acceptable collateral in validating the model. That was the moment the story crossed from voyeurism into premeditation, and Lena felt something harden inside her. A resolve that was less emotional than procedural. Because if her life had been reduced to a test case, then the only rational response was to invalidate the experiment. Escalation followed quickly, as Andrea warned them that accessing the drives would trigger attention. Not alarms exactly, but anomalies in data flow that people like her were trained to notice. And within 48 hours, Lena began to experience what could only be described as pressure. Subtle at first, an unexpected audit at work. A lender calling to revisit her mortgage terms, a neighbor asking oddly specific questions about her schedule but cumulatively unmistakable. The system nudging her back into predictability, testing whether she would retreat or comply. The confrontation peaked when a man named Harold Vance appeared at her door, presenting himself as a representative from a private risk consultancy, polished calm, carrying documents that framed everything as a misunderstanding and opportunity, even offering Lena a choice couched in professionalism. Cooperate quietly, allow her data to continue being anonymized and abstracted, and in return receive protection from the cascading consequences of exposure, or escalate publicly and accept outcomes she couldn't control. A threat delivered without menace, because menace would have implied uncertainty. Lena didn't argue, didn't accuse, didn't even refuse outright. She simply asked one question, the kind that derails rehearsed scripts. Who decided my consent was optional? And when Vance deflected with language about aggregate benefit and systemic safety, she understood that this confrontation would never resolve through debate, because the system did not recognize moral challenge as valid input. The final escalation came that night, when Lena, Noah, and Andrea convened in the hidden room one last time, not to gather more evidence, but to stage an exit, copying select files that demonstrated pattern without exposing subjects, redacting names, while preserving structure, and preparing a package designed not for media spectacle but for regulatory choke point state attorneys general, federal oversight committees, ethics boards that operated slowly but inexorably, and as they worked, Lena felt the weight of what she was about to lose. The curated stability, the plausible deniability, the quiet life she had built on the assumption that systems, while flawed, were fundamentally bounded by law. Because confronting this meant accepting that the next chapter would be defined not by comfort but by consequence. The confrontation ended not with a knock at the door or a dramatic arrest, but with a choice made in silence as Lena sealed the final envelope. Understanding that the hidden room had done what it was designed to do, force a subject into a decision that revealed who they really were, and this time the data point would not behave as predicted. The aftermath did not arrive as a single moment of reckoning, but as a long, grinding recalibration. The kind that rewrites lives not through spectacle, but through attrition. And in the weeks after Lena Whitmore sent the packages, nothing visibly happened, which was almost worse. Because silence in systems like the one she had challenged was never neutral. It was evaluative, a pause while unseen actors assessed damage and adjusted strategy. She returned to work under the weight of heightened scrutiny, every email phrased carefully, every meeting documented twice, her reputation shifting from dependable to complex, a euphemism she recognized as professional quarantine. And when the internal audit she had been warned about materialized, it found nothing actionable but left behind a residue of doubt that would follow her for months. Noah Klein returned to his own life with an understanding that his expertise had limits, that technical safeguards meant little against organizations designed to operate in legal gray zones. And Andrea Pell, who had once believed escape was the same as freedom, stayed close for a time, not out of solidarity but vigilance. Because once you know the contours of a system, you never fully stop watching for its shadow. The true consequences emerged unevenly, starting with small, almost invisible wins: a state ethics inquiry, quietly expanding its scope, a federal agency issuing a request for records that forced the consultancy Harold Vance, represented, to suspend certain legacy projects, and then, months later, a sealed court filing that referenced non-consensual longitudinal behavioral data collection, language so dry it disguised how unprecedented it was. And Lena learned that systems unravel the same way they're built, incrementally, through paperwork, through risk assessments, through individuals who decide, one by one, that maintaining the status quo costs more than dismantling it. The hidden room itself did not survive the process, because lawyers, on Simbodbed, have a way of turning physical secrets into liabilities. And after a court order and a parade of inspectors, it was sealed, documented, and eventually demolished. The wardrobe hauled away like any other piece of junk, its significance flattened by procedure. And yet the absence it left behind was louder than its presence had ever been. Because without the room, Lena was forced to confront the more unsettling truth. The architecture was never the most dangerous part. What lingered were the habits of thinking it had encouraged, the instinct to second-guess coincidence, to interrogate opportunity, to wonder whether any path she took was entirely her own. She moved out of the house on Alder Creek Road within a year, not because it felt unsafe, but because it felt a place that had framed her life around a secret she no longer carried. And in a smaller apartment, closer to the city, she rebuilt again. This time with fewer illusions about autonomy, but a clearer sense of responsibility. Andrea eventually disappeared from Lena's daily orbit. Not in fear, but by design, choosing a life intentionally a quiet defiance that came from understanding how much predictability she had surrendered to be left alone. And the last Lena heard of her was through a postcard mailed from a national park. No return address. A single sentence written in careful block letters. Freedom is a moving target. Closure, Lena learned, was not the same as resolution. Because even as investigations wound down and policies shifted, she was left with questions that had no institutional answer about how many other rooms existed, how many people had been nudged without ever knowing, how many acceptable collaterals were still waiting to be justified by models that mistook control for safety. And those questions became the quiet engine of her next chapter, guiding her into advocacy work that sat uncomfortably between compliance and conscience, where she spoke not in absolutes, but in probabilities, reminding rooms full of professionals that data without consent is not insight, it's trespass. The closing of this chapter was not triumphant, not cathartic, but honest, marked by an acceptance that systems rarely collapse cleanly, and that resisting them often means trading certainty for integrity. And as Lena looked back once, only once, at the life she had assumed was hers alone, she understood that the hidden room had changed everything, not by revealing a secret, but by stripping away the comfort of believing there were limits someone else was always responsible for enforcing. What happens after a secret like that is exposed is rarely what people imagine, because endings are not conclusions. They are transitions, And Lena Whitmore learned that the most lasting impact of the hidden room was not the investigations, the sealed filings, or even the dismantling of the network itself, but the way it permanently altered her relationship with certainty. She no longer believed in clean narratives, where truth automatically leads to justice, or in the comforting idea that oversight always arrives before harm. And instead, she came to understand something more uncomfortable and more useful. Systems change only when ordinary people refuse to play their assigned roles. Even when the cost is personal, even when the outcome is unclear. Lena didn't become famous, didn't publish didn't turn her experience into a brand, because visibility was never the point. Accountability was, and she chose to work quietly with advocacy groups, regulators, and ethics boards, helping them identify the blind spots that allow risk anticipation to mutate into quiet abuse. Always careful to strip stories of spectacle and return them to structure, because spectacle burns out, but structure endures. Noah Klein went back to his work with a sharpened edge, pushing clients harder on questions of data, provenance, and consent. No longer satisfied with technical compliance that ignored human impact, while Andre Appel remained a ghost in the periphery. A reminder that survival sometimes looks like disappearance, and together, though rarely in the same room again. They represented three different responses to the same revelation: reform, resistance, and retreat. The house on Alder Creek Road eventually sold to another family, its listing cheerful and unremarkable. No mention of what had once existed beneath the floorboards, because history has a way of being paved over when it becomes inconvenient. And yet the story didn't end there, because it never really does. It just changes hands, moving from lived experience into cautionary tale, from hidden room into shared warning. This story, brought to you by Deep Dive Secrets, exists not to provoke paranoia but to challenge complacency, to ask where observation ends and manipulation begins, and how often we accept invisible trade-offs in exchange for comfort, stability, or the illusion of safety. If you've stayed with this story to the end, consider what it means that so much power depends on silence, and how Izali silence can be mistaken for consent. Because the most dangerous rooms are not always the ones hidden behind walls, but the ones normalized through routine, language, and trust. Here on Deep Dive Secrets, we tell stories that live in that uncomfortable space, where family ties, personal histories, and institutional incentives collide. Not to offer easy villains or neat morals, but to invite deeper questions that linger long after the screen goes dark. So if this story made you pause, if it unsettled you in a way that felt uncomfortably real, take a moment to like the video. Subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who believes privacy is a given rather than a boundary that must be defended. New stories arrive every week, each one peeling back another layer of what we assume is ordinary, because sometimes the truth isn't buried to be hidden forever, it's buried to see who is willing to dig.